Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the most iconic structures in history, the Colosseum. Imagine yourself in the midst of the colossal arena, the echo of thousands of voices swelling in the air as you feel the heat of the midday sun on your skin. The sand beneath your feet is worn and blood-stained from years of brutal games. The crowd is roaring around you, faces twisted in anticipation. The vast stone walls rise like ancient giants around the space, a testament to Roman grandeur. But, as you stand there, you realize this place, despite its beauty, was built for violence. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. Let's see where you're tuning in from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In ancient Rome, the Colosseum wasn't just a grand monument, it was a stage for the most extraordinary and dangerous spectacles of the time. Gladiatorial combat, mock naval battles, wild animal hunts, they were all part of the package. Picture it, you've entered the arena, and the crowd goes silent as they wait for the first fight to begin. The adrenaline is palpable. You're part of something massive, something that echoes through history. The Colosseum's construction began in AD 72 under Emperor Vespasian. It was completed in AD 80 under his son Titus, and further modifications were made by Emperor Domitian. The building itself could hold between 50,000 to 80,000 spectators, depending on who you ask. It was the heart of Roman entertainment, and it's hard to deny the sheer scale of what was accomplished in just under a decade. Roman engineers and architects were masters of their craft, designing an arena with a complex system of tunnels, trapdoors, and even elevators to create an ever-changing stage for the bloody performances. But it wasn't just the building's architecture that was impressive, it was the shows that took place there. Every event was meticulously planned, orchestrated to not just entertain, but also to manipulate the emotions and loyalty of the masses. Whether it was the thrill of gladiators battling to the death, the exotic spectacle of lions attacking helpless criminals, or the incredible mock naval battles that flooded the arena with water, the Colosseum had something for everyone. What's particularly fascinating, though, is how the games were more than just entertainment. They were a political tool. The emperors used these events to gain favor with the people, offering bread and circuses to distract from political problems. It wasn't just about watching a fight, it was about watching the emperor's power in action. Historians still argue whether the Colosseum was primarily a symbol of Rome's might or a tool to keep the population pacified. And those spectacles? They were dangerous, both for the participants and for the spectators. Imagine being one of the gladiators, standing at the entrance, waiting to be pushed into the arena to face a foe armed with a deadly weapon. You might have been a seasoned fighter, or you might have been one of the many slaves forced into combat, with no hope of surviving. Every fight was a chance at glory, or a swift and brutal end. Yet, for the spectators, there was a certain excitement in knowing that life and death were just a breath away. Gladiators trained for years, some of them, becoming celebrities of their time. But for many, the games were a matter of survival. And the crowds? They were ruthless, cheering, jeering, and giving the thumbs up or thumbs down. They had the power to decide whether a defeated gladiator would live or die. That iconic thumbs up you've probably seen in movies. It wasn't as simple as a thumbs up for good job. Historians still argue over its meaning, with some suggesting it actually meant death for the gladiator, while others believe it was a sign of mercy. The reality of the games was much darker than the glittering spectacle suggests. The Colosseum was built for blood, for death, and for entertainment. Every corner of the arena tells a story of Roman culture's complex relationship with violence, power, and showmanship. As the fight in the arena continues, you can almost feel the heat from the fires of the arena's inner workings, those trapdoors opening, the tension as the crowd eagerly waits for the next act. The games weren't just about bloodshed, they were about control, about the emperor's ability to command the spectacle of life and death, to create a sense of awe and fear among the Roman people. And it worked. What's interesting is that while the Colosseum was intended to show the might of the empire, it was also a symbol of Roman excess. Rome, at its peak, was a city of over 1 million people, all eager for distraction, for drama, for spectacle. And the Colosseum was the stage where that drama played out. But was it only a tool for political manipulation, or did it serve as a deeper reflection of Roman society? Historians still debate this. Some see it as an embodiment of Roman power, while others suggest it was a sign of the empire's decline, an indication that Romans had lost touch with the fundamental values of their civilization. In the end, whether you're sitting in the emperor's box or standing in the sand, the Colosseum is a reminder of Rome's complexity, its obsession with control, its fascination with violence, and its need for entertainment. As you take a moment to catch your breath, the sounds of the Colosseum wash over you again. The crowd's chants echo like a distant thunderstorm, the tension rising with every passing second. But this isn't just about gladiators in the arena, it's about their origins, the harsh reality of their existence. You realize, with a hint of unease, that the men who fought here weren't always soldiers or trained warriors. Some were slaves, captured from conquered lands, others were criminals, condemned to fight for their lives. And then there were the volunteers, the ones who willingly stepped forward, hoping for fame, fortune, and the distant dream of freedom. Gladiatorial combat didn't start with grand arenas like the Colosseum. It began long before, back in the early days of Rome, with the Etruscans. The Etruscans, who lived in the area we now call Tuscany, had their own version of gladiatorial games. These were not originally meant for entertainment, but for ritual purposes. They would hold mock battles as a way to honor the dead, a practice tied to their religious beliefs. It wasn't until Rome absorbed the Etruscans into its growing empire that gladiatorial combat transitioned from ritual to public entertainment. The first recorded gladiatorial games in Rome took place in 264 BC, organized by a man named Decimus Junius Brutus in honor of his father's death. Imagine yourself sitting in a makeshift arena, the clash of swords ringing in your ears as men fight to the death, all for a funeral. As gladiatorial combat grew more popular, the Romans began to see it as a way to demonstrate their power and control. And that's when the training began. Gladiators weren't just thrown into the arena without preparation. They were trained in special schools called ludi. These schools were often located on the outskirts of Rome, and they were harsh, brutal places. A ludus was a mix between a military barracks and a prison. The men who lived there were subjected to daily routines that included intense physical training, sword fighting, and learning the intricate choreography of the fights they would perform. Gladiators who survived long enough to become stars often had their own fan base, with people cheering their names as though they were athletes. But not all gladiators had the luxury of fighting for fame. Many were slaves who had no choice but to fight for survival. These men often came from all corners of the empire, from Gaul, from the East, and even from Africa. They were captured in battle or sold into slavery, forced into the ludi with little hope of escape. In fact, the life expectancy of a gladiator was shockingly short, often only a few years. Even the most skilled fighters, those with the sharpest swords and the quickest reflexes, knew that they were living on borrowed time. Interestingly, Not all gladiators fought to the death. Contrary to popular belief, many gladiatorial contests were not intended to end in fatality. Fights were often staged with an air of theatricality, and it wasn't uncommon for a defeated gladiator to be spared, especially if they fought valiantly. The decision was often left in the hands of the editor, the person in charge of the games, often an emperor or wealthy aristocrat. Historians still argue whether the fate of a defeated gladiator was more in the hands of the crowd than the editor. In some cases, a simple thumbs up or thumbs down from the audience could seal the fate of a gladiator. But while the crowd's reaction might determine the outcome of one fight, it wasn't always about mercy. In fact, the most iconic battles weren't about mercy at all. They were about public execution. There were many types of executions in ancient Rome, but the most brutal took place in the arena. Criminals, slaves, and prisoners of war could all be condemned to fight to the death in front of the cheering masses. These criminal fights were often arranged as a form of public spectacle, meant to show the power of the empire. Sometimes, these executions were choreographed, with the criminals fighting against each other or against wild animals. At other times, they were one-sided affairs, with no chance of survival. And the crowd loved it. There's something almost chilling about how these public executions were turned into entertainment. The people of Rome reveled in the spectacle of death, seeing it not as a grim reality, but as a form of sport. As you sit back in your imaginary seat, watching the chaos unfold, you begin to grasp the full magnitude of what it meant to be a gladiator in ancient Rome. These men were not just fighters, they were symbols of Rome's power, and their fates were tied to the whims of the emperor and the crowd. For some, the arena was a path to glory, to riches, and even to freedom. For others, it was nothing more than a brutal end to a brutal life. But for all the darkness and danger of the gladiatorial games, they were also a reflection of the complex society in which they thrived. Rome was a city built on violence, yes, but it was also a city obsessed with spectacle, with showing the world the extent of its power. And the Colosseum was the perfect stage for that power to be displayed. Even in its bloodiest moments, the arena was a place where the Roman elite could come together, forget their worries, and watch as men, often men much like themselves, fought for their lives in a battle that was as much about survival as it was about status. As the dust settles from the last brutal fight, you find yourself gazing out over the arena, trying to process everything that you've just witnessed. But there's more to this than just gladiators, much more. The wild animal fights. Imagine it, a large, imposing tiger strutting across the arena floor, followed closely by the scent of sweat and fear. It's not just the men who are fighting to the death. These magnificent beasts are too. The question lingers, were these fights really about showing dominance, or were they a more sinister part of Rome's entertainment? It's hard to grasp just how many animals were slaughtered in the name of Roman sport. The Colosseum's early games saw not just gladiators battling each other, but also hundreds of animals, ranging from lions, tigers, and bears to crocodiles and exotic birds. They were pitted against gladiators, criminals, or each other in fights meant to amaze, horrify, and thrill the audience. In fact, there's a record that suggests over 9,000 animals were killed in a series of games that lasted for just one day during the reign of Emperor Trajan. Imagine that, nearly 10,000 creatures slaughtered for the amusement of a single crowd. The Romans loved to showcase their mastery over the natural world. They imported exotic animals from every corner of the empire, displaying them in a spectacle that was as much about the empire's wealth and power as it was about their ability to control nature itself. But what does this say about the Romans' view of life? Was it just about showing their superiority over animals, or was it deeper than that? Some scholars suggest that these shows were a way of proving that the Romans could control even the most dangerous creatures from the farthest reaches of the empire. You see, the more exotic the animal, the more prestigious the emperor who could afford to have it brought into the arena. And yet, historians still argue whether the true purpose of the animal fights was to maintain power, or if it was simply to serve as an extreme form of public entertainment. But there's something even more disturbing behind these animal fights. They weren't just a test of strength or skill. They were also used as a form of punishment. Criminals or prisoners of war could be sentenced to fight animals as a public execution. Imagine the terror you'd feel as a condemned prisoner, your only weapon a spear, facing a lion in the middle of the arena. It wasn't just the gladiators who faced death in the Colosseum. Sometimes it was the condemned criminals, too. Even more than the gladiatorial combat, these animal fights were truly savage. Wild animals, bred for nothing more than violence, were unleashed on helpless human beings. And the crowd? They went wild. They reveled in the carnage, cheering on the bloodshed, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For the spectators, these events weren't just about entertainment. They were about watching an empire exert its absolute power, toying with life and death in ways that are hard to comprehend from a modern perspective. But what did the animals themselves think? We can only guess. The majority of these animals were kept in small, cramped cages for most of their lives, only to be dragged out for a few moments of terror in the arena. This treatment of animals in the Colosseum was brutal, to say the least. The Roman elite did everything they could to capture and transport these animals, often bringing them to the city from faraway lands, only to kill them in front of an adoring crowd. What's even more striking is that there are records of certain animals being trained to fight, not just with gladiators, but with other beasts. It's chilling to think about the kinds of trainers who would force these animals into combat, teaching them to become weapons rather than creatures of nature. The spectacle reached its peak with the Venetianes, the hunting games. These events could involve anything from hunting exotic animals to full-on staged battles between humans and animals. In some of these battles, the gladiators were armed only with spears or nets, forced to outsmart animals that were often much stronger and faster. The audience would cheer as lions and tigers charged toward their would-be victims, sometimes mauling them, sometimes forcing the gladiators into a corner from which there was no escape. Some of these battles were staged to showcase not just the skill of the gladiators, but also the overwhelming power of the beasts they faced. It's said that the most popular animals in these events were lions and bears, beasts known for their strength and ferocity. But the Venetianes didn't just stop at land animals. The arena was even flooded to stage naval battles, where men on ships fought, not only each other but also water-dwelling creatures like crocodiles. There's an eerie, almost tragic quality to these spectacles. The animals didn't stand a chance. They were bred, captured, and trained solely for the purpose of dying in a bloody, public display of dominance. They were forced into these brutal battles, often unprepared for the violence that would befall them. And yet, these events went on for centuries, as if they were part of the Roman identity itself. One particularly gruesome record shows that, during the reign of Emperor Titus, a series of games were held to celebrate the opening of the Colosseum. Over 5,000 animals were killed in just 100 days. The sheer scale of this slaughter is almost unimaginable. It wasn't just a battle between man and beast. It was a testament to the Romans' ability to control not just people, but the natural world itself. Today, the Colosseum stands as a monument to this history, a reminder of how deeply rooted violence was in the cultural and social fabric of ancient Rome. The brutal animal fights, while undeniably horrifying, were also a key part of what made the arena so powerful, so captivating. The people who watched these games weren't just witnessing death, they were watching the empire flex its muscle, proving that even the wildest creatures could be tamed and killed in the name of sport. As the dust from the animal fight settles, a new kind of tension fills the air. The crowd, which just moments ago cheered for the beasts' brutal deaths, now waits for something far more personal, something that could shift the fate of the gladiators themselves. This next fight isn't just about survival, it's about something much deeper: fame and freedom. The arena, bathed in the late afternoon light, casts long shadows over the sand, and you can almost feel the weight of those gladiators' hopes and dreams pressing in on you. You've probably heard stories about gladiators achieving fame, and for some of them, that fame was everything. The ancient world didn't have the kind of celebrity culture we do today, but gladiators came close. In a world where most people lived in obscurity, gladiators were the true stars of their time. When a gladiator survived long enough to become a well-known name, they were treated like royalty. Some even had their own fan clubs. It's hard to believe, but records show that some gladiators had more fans than some emperors. But fame wasn't the only thing they sought. For the most skilled gladiators, the real prize was freedom. Imagine being trapped in the blood-stained arena, your life constantly at risk, and then being offered a chance at freedom. It wasn't a promise given lightly, but it existed nonetheless. The idea of the rudis, a wooden sword, symbolized freedom. If a gladiator fought well enough and won the crowd's favor, if they survived enough battles, there was a chance they could be granted their freedom. The rudis was the ultimate symbol of triumph. To hold it in your hands meant that, after years of fighting, you would no longer be bound by chains, and you would no longer have to fight for the amusement of the masses. But this freedom was a rare gift. Only a few lucky gladiators ever achieved it. For most, the fight was a daily struggle, day after day in the ludi, facing off in the arena for a cruel twist of fate. The thought of the rudis would be enough to motivate even the most fearful gladiator, but it was a long shot. The audience might love a fighter, but the decision was ultimately up to the emperor or the editor of the games. The gladiatorial games weren't just about battle, they were also about psychological warfare. The gladiators had to be more than skilled fighters. They had to be able to read the crowd, to know when to fight hard and when to hold back. Sometimes, a gladiator's life didn't depend on their combat skills alone, it depended on their ability to win the crowd's favor. This, of course, could be a double-edged sword. Gladiators who performed well and earned the admiration of the masses were often spared, but if they were seen as weak, they were sometimes forced to fight until they could no longer continue. There's an intriguing contradiction in the arena too. You'd think that gladiators, with their constant exposure to death, would be hardened men, emotionless, detached from the violence they saw every day. But that wasn't always the case. Many gladiators developed deep friendships with one another, bound by shared hardship and the ever-present threat of death. Some even developed rivalries that became legendary. These rivalries, along with their friendships, made the arena much more than just a place of killing. It became a theater of emotions, of human connection, in a setting where those connections were fragile and fleeting. Historians still argue whether gladiators fought for more than just survival. Did they fight for fame? For wealth? For a shot at freedom? Some suggest that the desire for freedom was more of a myth, something romanticized by later generations. Others argue that the very idea of the rudis was enough to motivate gladiators to risk their lives over and over again. There's no clear answer, but one thing is certain: the gladiator's life was a gamble. The price of survival was steep, but the reward, if you were lucky enough to survive long enough, could be sweet. Yet, not all gladiators had the opportunity to win their freedom. Some were far more expendable. Slaves or prisoners of war were thrown into the arena with no hope of survival, their lives a mere plaything for the crowd. For these men, there was no rudis at the end of the tunnel, only an inevitable death. The very nature of the games meant that while a few could achieve fame or freedom, the majority would simply fade into the sand, forgotten and unnamed. As you watch the gladiators in the arena, fighting with everything they have, you can't help but wonder what goes through their minds. Are they thinking of the fame that could be theirs? Of the rudis they might one day hold in their hands? Or are they simply focused on surviving the next moment, the next clash of swords, the next deadly attack from an opponent? These men weren't just warriors, they were symbols of Roman society's deepest contradictions. They were at once celebrated heroes and pitiable victims, fighting for their lives in the most brutal of circumstances. The gladiators' struggle for fame and freedom is a tale of hope and despair, of ambition and resignation. As you sit back in your seat, watching the fight unfold before you, you can't help but wonder, how many of the men in this arena will be remembered in history? How many will die here, their names lost to time, forgotten in the sands of the Colosseum? You hear the clashing of swords once more as the dust settles around the gladiators. Their blood mixes with the sand, creating a grim reminder of what happens in the arena. But now, there's a shift. It's no longer just about mortal combat between men. No, this next spectacle will push the boundaries of what you thought possible. The naumachii, mock naval battles staged in the Colosseum itself. Picture it, huge ships, rigged with sails, locked in combat on what appears to be an actual sea. But wait, this is the Colosseum. You know it's not a real ocean. So how are they going to pull this off? The Romans were nothing if not inventive. The naumachii were some of the most extraordinary events ever held in the Colosseum. Imagine a giant, flooded arena, brimming with water, where entire naval battles were fought for the amusement of the crowd. This wasn't just a small skirmish. No, this was an all-out naval conflict, with ships that could carry dozens of men, engaged in combat right before your eyes. The Romans would fill the Colosseum with water, sometimes using a series of canals or even siphoning water from nearby sources, and then float real ships onto the flooded arena. These mock naval battles weren't just about the spectacle of water splashing everywhere. They were a chance for the emperor to show off the might of the Roman fleet and remind everyone just how powerful the empire really was. But who would fight in these mock battles? Gladiators? Yes, but also criminals or prisoners of war, often forced to take on the role of sailors. They would be placed aboard these ships, which were often equipped with real weapons like rams and swords, and forced to fight as though they were naval soldiers. In some cases, the battles were reenactments of famous naval engagements, showing the crowd just how well the Romans understood the importance of naval supremacy. The naumachii were grand spectacles, designed to display the empire's dominance over both land and sea, and the crowds went wild for them. It wasn't just about watching people die, it was about experiencing the power of Rome in action. Historians still debate how often these naval battles were staged. Some argue that only a few were ever truly held, while others claim that they were part of the regular spectacle that filled the Colosseum's calendar. One of the most famous naumachii was organized by Emperor Titus in AD 80 to celebrate the opening of the Colosseum. In this battle, it's said that over 3,000 men participated, fighting aboard massive ships that were set afloat on the Colosseum floor. Imagine that, 3,000 men, each fighting for survival on a flooded floor, surrounded by the roaring crowd. It's said that Titus spared no expense, creating an event that would be remembered for generations. But as spectacular as it was, the logistics behind such a grand affair were mind-boggling. Creating an arena large enough to hold multiple ships, filling it with enough water to float them, and then clearing the arena afterward, it must have been a logistical nightmare, but the Romans loved it. The Naumachii were a showcase of Roman engineering and their love of excess, a perfect blend of violence and spectacle. Of course, the question must be asked, why would the Romans go to such lengths for this form of entertainment? Was it simply because they had the resources and the desire to show off? Or was there a deeper meaning to these naval reenactments? Some scholars suggest that these naval battles were a way of reinforcing Rome's naval superiority, a reminder to the empire's enemies that no one could match the might of the Roman fleet. After all, if you could recreate a battle on the water in the heart of the empire, what could your enemies possibly hope to achieve? But there's also an argument that the Naumachii were a symbol of something else entirely, a reflection of the Roman obsession with control. The Romans prided themselves on their ability to bring order to chaos, to tame even the forces of nature. Flooding the Colosseum to stage a naval battle wasn't just about impressing the crowd. It was about demonstrating that the Romans had conquered not only the land but the very seas themselves. It was an act of control, a way of showing that no matter the environment, the Romans could shape it to their will. As the water splashes and the ships clash, you can't help but marvel at the scale of it all. The Colosseum, once a simple arena, has now become a place where nearly anything seems possible. It's a testament to Roman ingenuity, to their love of spectacle, and to their unyielding desire to show the world their dominance. And yet, there's something almost tragic about it too. The men fighting in these mock battles weren't just participants in a grand game. They were at the mercy of the empire's whims, caught in a cycle of violence that they could never escape. The Naumachii were, in many ways, the perfect reflection of Roman society. They were elaborate, extravagant, and deeply violent. They showcased the power of the Roman Empire, but they also reminded everyone watching that, in the end, the only thing that mattered was survival. Whether it was a gladiator fighting for fame or a sailor fighting for his life, the arena was a place where every man was equal in one respect. Death could come for any of them at any moment. And so, as the battle in the flooded arena rages on, the crowd continues to cheer. The Romans, for all their obsession with spectacle, understood one thing very well. In the end, it was always about survival. The echoes of the Naumachii still linger in your mind as the spectacle shifts once again, this time focusing on something even more mind-boggling: the Colosseum's elevation system. You can feel your curiosity peak. How could they possibly manage to raise and lower gladiators, animals, and entire sets in the blink of an eye? This was no ordinary arena. The Romans, known for their engineering genius, had designed an arena that was not only grand in scale, but also technologically advanced for its time. Imagine watching the ground in front of you shift, as if the arena itself were a living, breathing thing, changing to suit whatever form of violence or drama was needed. At the heart of this transformation was the intricate system of lifts and trap-doors that powered the Colosseum's rapid changes in scenery. The velarium, a massive retractable awning, would be unfurled to protect the spectators from the harsh Roman sun, and the Colosseum would suddenly seem to come alive, shifting from one spectacle to the next. Beneath the arena floor was an entire labyrinth of passageways and chambers, where gladiators, animals, and stagehands waited for their moment to enter the stage. This underground world, known as the hypogym, was where the real magic happened. You can almost hear the clanging of metal and the tense rustling of chains as you imagine the intricate system of elevators and pulleys that brought the fighters, animals, and props into view. Some of the animals, lions, tigers, even elephants, were raised through trapdoors, sometimes with startling speed, so that they could appear seemingly out of nowhere. The surprise of their sudden appearance only added to the spectacle, making the games feel even more unpredictable. And then there were the gladiators. They would wait in the darkened chambers beneath the Colosseum, knowing that their time to fight could come at any moment. The tension must have been unbearable as they were raised to the surface, into the arena, where their fate would be decided in front of thousands of eager eyes. The Hypergeum wasn't just a maze, it was an architectural wonder. It consisted of 2 levels, each filled with rooms, corridors, and mechanical devices. You can almost picture the scene, as the emperor or the editor of the games gave the signal. A gladiator might be raised up through one of these trapdoors, emerging into the arena with nothing but his weapon and the will to survive. Or an animal might burst through a separate door, roaring and ready to attack, just as the crowd erupted into cheers. It wasn't just about the fights, it was about the entire experience, the spectacle of watching the arena shift and change, as if the gods themselves were controlling the action. Historians are still fascinated by the technical prowess of the Hypergeum. How did they manage to create such an efficient, complex system of lifts, pulleys, and trapdoors? The answer lies in the Romans' engineering ingenuity. The arena's underground network was powered by a series of winches and pulleys, operated by slaves or other workers hidden from the audience. Some of these lifts were even designed to move multiple gladiators or animals at once, speeding up the process and making the transitions between events seem almost magical. It was a marvel of engineering, designed to give the spectators the illusion that the Colosseum could transform at will, presenting them with a constantly changing environment that heightened the drama. And yet, despite the impressive technology, there was a darker side to this system. The Hypergeum wasn't just a place where gladiators and animals waited, it was also where they suffered. Gladiators were often kept in dark, cramped cells, waiting for their turn to fight, their fate uncertain. The air would have been thick with the tension of anticipation and fear. You can almost feel the weight of it, the knowledge that the lift could rise at any moment, and you would be thrust into the arena with little more than your training to protect you. For the animals, it was even worse. Many were kept in cages so small that they couldn't move freely. They were sometimes starved to make them more aggressive, ensuring that the fights would be as intense as possible. Historians still debate the exact number of lifts and trapdoors that were used in the Colosseum, but estimates suggest there were at least 24 lifts scattered throughout the arena. These lifts were often hidden beneath the sand, creating the illusion that the action could appear from nowhere. The spectacle of a fighter or animal suddenly emerging into the arena must have been breathtaking. It was as if the Colosseum itself were alive, breathing, shifting to meet the demands of the emperor and the crowd. But behind the scenes, the Hypergeum was also a place of brutal realities. The gladiators who fought in the arena were often treated as expendable. Their lives were constantly at risk, and the underground network of tunnels and rooms served as a grim reminder of the empire's willingness to sacrifice lives for entertainment. It wasn't just the gladiators who faced death. Many of the animals that fought in the arena were taken from the wild and forced into combat, often dying in the process. The Colosseum, for all its grandeur and spectacle, was also a place where life was cheap and death was constant. It's remarkable to think about how the Colosseum, in all its magnificence, could hold such an eerie secret beneath its surface. The Hypergeum was a place of preparation, of anticipation, and of death. It was here that the true drama unfolded, where the gladiators and animals were readied for their moments in the spotlight, often at the cost of their lives. It was a chilling reminder that the Colosseum was more than just a grand arena. It was a machine built to entertain, regardless of the cost. In the end, the Colosseum's elevation system wasn't just a marvel of engineering, it was a symbol of the empire's control over life and death. It showed the lengths the Romans would go to in order to maintain their power, to ensure that the games would continue, no matter what. And as you sit back, watching the next fight unfold, you can't help but wonder how many more lives would be sacrificed before this night was over. The arena is still alive with energy as you watch the spectacle unfold. The crowd's roar echoes in your ears, but there's something even more compelling now. You notice the emperor's seat, high above the arena floor, the position of ultimate power. The emperor didn't just sit there to watch the games. He held the fate of the gladiators, animals, and even entire events in his hands. And it wasn't just about showing off the Roman Empire's dominance. It was about using the games as a political tool, manipulating the crowd with every decision, every fight, every death. You can't help but wonder, what did it feel like to sit in that seat? As the emperor, you had the power to decide who lived and who died, who was victorious and who was sent to the afterlife. The arena was the emperor's stage, and the games were his performance. Every gladiatorial battle, every wild animal fight, was a chance to demonstrate not just Roman power, but Roman values, strength, discipline, and order. The crowd, hungry for excitement and entertainment, could be easily swayed by the emperor's gestures. A simple wave of the hand could determine whether a defeated gladiator would be spared or killed. But while the emperor wielded this power, he was not immune to the whims of the crowd. The spectators, as we've seen before, could be just as ruthless as the gladiators themselves. The emperor's decision was often influenced by the loudest voices in the crowd, those who cried for death or for mercy. The crowd's mood could shift in an instant, and the emperor had to be quick to read the signs. Historians still debate how much the emperor actually controlled the outcomes of the games. Was he simply a puppet, pulling the strings to satisfy the crowd's bloodlust, or did he genuinely hold the power to make life and death decisions? It's still a topic of much discussion among scholars, as the answer is far from clear. In many ways, the emperor's role in the games mirrored the role of the gladiators themselves. Both were part of a larger performance, a show designed to entertain and to control. The emperor, just like the gladiators, had to be a master of the art of performance. He had to know how to read the room, how to give the people what they wanted, but also how to maintain control. The games were as much about politics as they were about bloodshed. The emperor used the Colosseum not just to entertain, but to reinforce his power, reminding the people who was in charge. As you sit there, imagining the scene, you start to realize how deeply intertwined the games were with the political life of Rome. They were a public spectacle, yes, but they were also a tool for the emperor to maintain his rule. The crowds loved the games, but they also feared them. The emperor's decisions could make or break a gladiator's career, and in some cases, they could even decide the fate of the empire itself. The power dynamics between the emperor, the gladiators, and the crowd were complex, shifting with every turn of the games. The emperor's power wasn't limited to just the games. The events in the Colosseum also had a deep connection to the emperor's relationship with the Roman Senate and the people. The games were often used as a way to show gratitude to the masses, or as a form of political appeasement. If an emperor wanted to gain favor, all they had to do was host a lavish series of games. The games were a public offering, a way to pacify the people and remind them of the emperor's generosity. It was a ritual of power, an extravagant display meant to keep the masses loyal and distracted. But not all emperors were able to control the games as they wished. Some emperors, like Caligula or Nero, were known for their erratic behavior, turning the Colosseum into a stage for their personal whims. These emperors didn't just use the arena for political purposes. They used it as a means of showing off their own eccentricities, often turning it into a venue for their own personal dramas. The crowd, for all their bloodlust, would have been able to tell the difference between a well-executed show of power and a chaotic display of madness. The emperor's relationship with the crowd was a delicate one. Too much control, and the people would turn against you. Too little, and the empire would fall into disarray. Historians still argue about how much power the emperor truly had in the games. Some believe that the emperor's role was mostly symbolic, that the real power lay with the editor, the man who organized the games and managed the finances. Others argue that the emperor held absolute control, making the games not just a spectacle, but a direct reflection of his rule. The debate continues, but what's clear is that the emperor's seat in the Colosseum was more than just a place to watch a fight. It was a throne from which the emperor could shape the very fabric of Roman society. As you watch the emperor's influence unfold, you can't help but feel the weight of it. The games are more than just fights. They are about control, about power, about who gets to decide who lives and who dies. The emperor is the puppet master, pulling the strings from his seat, while the gladiators are his pawns, forced to fight for the entertainment of the masses. The Colosseum, in all its grandeur, is a stage for a much larger drama, one that plays out not just in the arena, but in the very heart of the Roman Empire. As you watch the emperor, whose presence dominates the arena, you begin to realize something. For all the grandeur of the Colosseum and the glory of the gladiators, the very idea of fame in the arena might seem strange to you. After all, we tend to associate fame with pop stars or athletes, people celebrated for their skill, their charisma, or their beauty. But in ancient Rome, fame had a different meaning, especially for those who fought in the Colosseum. In fact, the concept of fame in the arena might be even more complex than you ever imagined. One of the most intriguing and perhaps surprising aspects of the gladiatorial games was the role of women, yes, women, in the arena. Contrary to the often one-dimensional view we have of ancient Rome, women did fight in the Colosseum. These female gladiators, known as gladiatresses, were rare, but their existence challenges the traditional narrative of the Colosseum being a strictly male-dominated arena. These women were not mere bystanders. They were warriors in their own right, fighting for glory and, perhaps, for freedom just like their male counterparts. The records of female gladiators are scarce, but some ancient texts make it clear that they were not just a curiosity, they were part of the spectacle. According to one account, Emperor Domitian even held games in which female gladiators fought each other in front of the crowd. The notion of women fighting in the Colosseum would have shocked many in the Roman world, where women were expected to stay out of public life and focus on more domestic roles. And yet, these gladiatresses performed alongside men, some even achieving fame for their skills and bravery. The reason for their presence in the arena is a subject of much debate. Some suggest that they were simply used as novelty acts, a way to shock and thrill the audience. Others argue that they were more than just spectacles. They were part of a broader culture of violence and entertainment that permeated Roman society. Regardless of the reasons, the presence of female gladiators in the Colosseum adds another layer of complexity to our understanding of the games. They were not just passive observers. They were active participants in the brutal world of gladiatorial combat. But were these women really fighting for the same reasons as the men? Were they too seeking fame, glory, or freedom? It's impossible to know for sure, but historians suggest that many female gladiators were slaves or prisoners, forced into the arena as a form of punishment or entertainment. Others may have volunteered, seeking fame or the prospect of a reward. However, it's worth noting that for the majority of gladiators, male or female, life in the arena wasn't glamorous. The brutal conditions, the constant threat of death, and the harsh training were a part of the grim reality that these fighters faced every day. In some ways, the female gladiators were both a reflection of and a challenge to the patriarchal structure of Roman society. They fought in the same brutal contests as their male counterparts, yet their presence also raised uncomfortable questions about gender roles and societal expectations. Historians still debate whether the female gladiators were seen as a curiosity by the crowd or whether they were respected warriors in their own right. Some scholars believe that, just like the male gladiators, the female fighters had their own fan base and followed. They could even achieve victory and, in rare cases, win their freedom. The idea of a female gladiator achieving fame, becoming a celebrated hero of the arena, is fascinating when you think about it. To be a gladiator meant more than just fighting. It was about crafting a reputation, about proving yourself in the eyes of the audience. And for those women who made it in the arena, their fame was no less significant than that of the men. They were the rare exceptions, but they were also a testament to the strange and unpredictable nature of Roman entertainment. There's something almost tragic in thinking about the life of a female gladiator. Their battles were not just physical, they were also symbolic of a society that was willing to stretch its limits, breaking down barriers, and creating a spectacle of bloodshed that had no boundaries. In a world where women were often confined to domestic roles, these gladiatresses broke the mold, risking their lives in front of a roaring crowd, fighting for reasons that may never be fully understood. Were they fighting for freedom? For fame? Or was it just another day in the arena, fighting for survival? The Colosseum's rich history leaves us with more questions than answers. The stories of these gladiatresses, though rare, are reminders that the arena was a space where anything could happen, a place where even the most unexpected figures could rise to fame. But their story, like that of the gladiators themselves, is one of both triumph and tragedy. The women who fought in the Colosseum may not have had the same legacy as their male counterparts, but they were part of the same brutal world. And in a society that was obsessed with violence and spectacle, they too found a place in the bloody history of the arena. As the fights continue around you, you realize that the story of the gladiators is far from simple. The arena wasn't just about men fighting for glory, it was about survival, about the lengths people were willing to go to in order to escape the violence, or to embrace it for a fleeting moment of fame. The female gladiators may have been rare, but they were part of the same story, showing that in the world of the Colosseum, no one was truly exempt from the bloodshed. The roar of the crowd reverberates in your ears as the next battle begins, the air thick with anticipation. But amidst the chaos of the arena, another layer of the Colosseum's history begins to unfold. It's no longer just about gladiators, animals, or the emperor's influence. This is where the ludi, gladiatorial schools, come into play. You might be surprised to learn that the gladiatorial games were not a random assortment of men and beasts thrown together for the amusement of the crowd. No, these games were meticulously planned, and they all began in one place, the ludi, the gladiator training schools. In ancient Rome, gladiators didn't just wake up one day and decide to fight in the arena. They were trained for months, sometimes years, to perfect their skills, and they came from specialized schools. The ludi were located all around the Roman Empire, with the most famous being in Rome itself. These schools were harsh, brutal places where gladiators were subjected to grueling training routines that mimicked the chaos and bloodshed they would experience in the arena. Picture it. Rows of gladiators sparring with wooden weapons, practicing their footwork, learning the art of combat with precision. Each school had its own distinct style of training, producing gladiators who were skilled in various forms of combat. But what makes the Ludi so fascinating is that they were more than just training grounds. They were a social institution, almost like a sports academy mixed with military training. Gladiators were treated as both athletes and soldiers. The focus wasn't just on fighting, it was on surviving the arena. Some gladiators fought for years, gaining a reputation for their strength and skill, while others were simply trapped in the cycle of violence, never having the chance to earn their freedom. The gladiators who were part of the Ludi weren't just there for their skill in battle. They were a symbol of Roman culture itself, a reflection of Rome's obsession with discipline, honor, and endurance. These men trained hard, not only for their survival, but also for their chance at freedom. The ultimate reward for any gladiator was the rudis, a wooden sword that symbolized freedom. But the path to freedom was long and difficult, and few gladiators ever reached that point. For the majority, the Ludi represented a never-ending cycle of combat, a life filled with danger and uncertainty. The men in the Ludi were typically slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. But some chose to become gladiators voluntarily, enticed by the promise of fame and fortune. These volunteers, known as octorati, were often seen as more skilled and experienced fighters because they chose to enter the world of gladiators rather than being forced into it. Their decision was a gamble, but one that could lead to fame if they were lucky enough to survive. In many cases, however, the octorati were lured in by promises of wealth or glory, only to find themselves trapped in the brutal world of the gladiatorial games. Their lives, like those of the slaves, were constantly at risk. Even in the midst of the grueling training, some gladiators became celebrities. These fighters didn't just survive, they thrived, winning multiple battles and earning the adoration of the crowds. Some gladiators became so famous that they had their own fan base, with people following them from one game to the next, eager to watch them fight. These gladiators didn't just fight for their lives. They fought for their reputation, for their place in Roman society, for a fleeting moment of fame that would be remembered for centuries. But for every famous gladiator, there were hundreds of others who never made it past the training grounds. The majority of gladiators were destined for a short, brutal life. The Ludi were harsh environments, where gladiators were pushed to their physical and mental limits, their bodies bruised and battered by the constant training. But it wasn't just about physical strength, it was about strategy, about learning the art of war in a way that could ensure your survival in the arena. Gladiators were trained to fight with a variety of weapons, from swords to tridents, and they had to master the techniques that would give them the best chance of winning. The Ludi were also home to a strict code of conduct. Gladiators were expected to maintain a certain level of discipline, both in and out of the arena. They were expected to respect their trainers, their fellow fighters, and the rules of the games. But it wasn't all about honor and respect. The gladiators who didn't live up to the expectations of their trainers or the crowd often faced harsh punishment. Some were forced to fight until they were too injured to continue. Others were cast aside, forgotten in the shadow of the more successful fighters. Interestingly, despite the often grim conditions, some gladiators formed deep bonds of friendship and loyalty with their fellow fighters. They shared a common experience of struggle, of survival, and of the constant threat of death. These relationships were forged in the heat of battle, and many gladiators would fight not just for their own survival, but for the survival of their comrades. The bond between gladiators was unique, part rivalry, part camaraderie. They were both enemies and allies, always united by the harsh realities of the arena. Historians still argue over the exact conditions in the ludi. Some suggest that the training was even more brutal than we can imagine, while others believe that there may have been some degree of camaraderie and respect between the gladiators and their trainers. The truth is likely somewhere in between. What is clear, however, is that the gladiators who came out of the ludi were not just warriors. They were symbols of Roman culture. They embodied the values of strength, discipline, and survival that were central to the Roman way of life. As the crowd cheers for the next gladiator, you can't help but feel the weight of their story. Behind every fight, every victory, every defeat, lies a history of training, struggle, and sacrifice. The ludi weren't just places where gladiators were made. They were places where Roman society's deepest values were forged and tested. The men who fought in the Colosseum may have been forced to do so, but their story is far more than one of brutality. It's a story of perseverance, of survival, and of a world where life and death were decided by the flick of a sword. As you sit there in the Colosseum, the roar of the crowd still echoing in your ears, your mind drifts to the most famous aspect of the gladiatorial games, the battles themselves. These fights were more than just bloodshed. They were grand, carefully orchestrated events, almost like a dance of death. But what made these battles so iconic wasn't just the combat. It was the rituals, the codes, and, perhaps most famously, the dramatic conclusion, the pollice verso, the thumbs up or thumbs down gesture. This gesture, now iconic in popular culture, didn't mean what we often think it does. Imagine the scene. A gladiator, his body bloodied and bruised, stands before the emperor or the crowd, waiting for his fate to be decided. The battle has ended. But the outcome of this fight won't be decided by the victor alone. It will be determined by a simple gesture from the emperor, or perhaps from the audience. Contrary to what many modern depictions suggest, the thumbs up didn't necessarily mean good job or well done. It could actually mean death. Historians still debate the exact meaning of the pollice verso, but many suggest that a thumbs up signaled the end of the fight, death for the defeated gladiator. On the other hand, the thumbs down gesture was often interpreted as a signal to spare the defeated gladiator's life, a sign of mercy from the emperor or the crowd. The truth, however, is a bit murkier. Some ancient sources suggest that the thumbs up signaled life and the thumbs down indicated death. The debate continues today. And yet, despite the confusion, one thing is certain. The pollice verso became a symbol of the power of the audience and the emperor. Life and death were in their hands, determined by a simple gesture, an arbitrary act that could make the difference between survival and a brutal end. The power of this gesture, and the fact that the crowd's mood could influence the fate of the gladiators, speaks volumes about Roman society. The emperor, the editor, and even the audience weren't just spectators. They were participants in the drama, shaping the outcome of the battle with every cheer, every gesture. For the gladiators, this made the games even more dangerous. You might fight valiantly, but if the crowd didn't like you, or if the emperor wasn't in the mood for mercy, your fate was sealed. The crowd, ever fickle, could turn on a fighter in an instant. One moment, you might be the hero of the arena. The next, you could be abandoned, left to die in the sands. It's chilling, really, to think about how much of the gladiator's fate depended on public opinion. For some, the fight was about winning favor with the crowd, about playing to the audience's bloodlust. For others, it was about survival, pure and simple. But in both cases, the outcome was out of their hands. You can almost imagine the fear that gripped the gladiators as they waited for the polis verso, not knowing whether they would live or die. The tension must have been unbearable, after all. This wasn't just about fighting your opponent. This was about fighting for your very life. The gladiators who survived these brutal battles often became legends, famous for their skill and bravery. But fame didn't guarantee safety. Even the most skilled gladiators were still at the mercy of the crowd and the emperor. And for those who were defeated, the polis verso was the final judgment. The stakes were as high as they could get. A fight in the Colosseum wasn't just about strength or skill, it was about living to see another day. And sometimes, no matter how well you fought, that wasn't enough, but the polis verso wasn't the only way to decide the fate of a gladiator. The crowd, too, had a role to play. The spectators could demand blood, and they would get it. The mood of the crowd could shift rapidly, and the emperor had to be aware of this. A crowd that grew restless or bloodthirsty could turn the tide of an entire game. A gladiator who performed well might be spared, but a fighter who didn't live up to expectations might find himself condemned to die. The emperor and the editor were constantly navigating this delicate balance, trying to keep the crowd entertained while maintaining control over the proceedings. Interestingly, the polis verso is just one part of the complex relationship between the gladiators and the audience. In some ways, the gladiators were more than just fighters. They were performers, actors in a drama that was staged for the people. The audience expected not only death, but spectacle, and the gladiators had to deliver. The crowd didn't just want to see a fight. They wanted to see a show. Gladiators who could create tension, who could fight with skill and drama, were the ones who captured the imagination of the crowd. The Colosseum was, in many ways, a theater of blood, a place where the fighters were both warriors and entertainers. This connection between performance and survival is fascinating. For the gladiators, the arena wasn't just a battleground, it was a stage. And as with any performance, the goal was to leave a lasting impression, to make the audience remember your name, your fight, your skill. Those who did it well could gain fame and even freedom. Those who failed, though, would fade into the annals of history, their names lost forever. As you reflect on this, the Colosseum seems to take on a darker, more complex meaning. It was more than just an arena for bloodshed. It was a place where survival was a performance, where skill could mean the difference between life and death. And the fate of the gladiators, ultimately, rested in the hands of the emperor, the crowd, and the simple, powerful gesture of the polis verso. The roar of the crowd still lingers in your ears as the scene shifts once more. As the excitement of the games reaches a crescendo, you start to notice something else. The Colosseum isn't just about gladiators or animals. It's also about public executions. Imagine being in the crowd, not watching a thrilling fight between trained warriors, but witnessing the cold, calculated death of a criminal. The atmosphere is charged with tension, but there's something even darker about these events. This is no staged battle. This is a real execution, a punishment meted out by the empire, and it happens before the eyes of thousands. Death here isn't just a spectacle, it's a lesson. Executions in the Colosseum weren't just about blood. They were about making a statement. The condemned weren't just criminals, they were symbols of the empire's power. To the people, these executions were a demonstration of Roman justice at its most public and absolute. But these weren't quiet, private affairs. No, public executions were a show, a bloody display meant to teach the masses what happened when you defied Roman law. Imagine the scene. The condemned are paraded out into the center of the arena, their fates sealed, their crimes exposed to the public. The crowd watches with a mix of anticipation and excitement, knowing that death is inevitable, but still hungry for the show. Criminals were not the only ones executed in the Colosseum. Prisoners of war, especially those from conquered territories, were sometimes condemned to fight in the arena, either against other prisoners or wild animals. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about humiliating those who dared to defy the empire. If the emperor wanted to send a message to the people, this was the way to do it. The arena was a stage where Rome's enemies could be shown, quite literally, as powerless. In some cases, these executions were ceremonial, almost theatrical, with the condemned forced to perform as if they were participating in a game. The crowd would cheer for the spectacle, and the condemned would die in front of thousands, their deaths reinforcing the idea of Roman superiority. But there's more to these public executions than meets the eye. They weren't always as straightforward as they seemed. Historians still argue about how the executions were presented. Were they a mere display of power, or did they serve a deeper purpose? Some scholars argue that these executions were a form of ritual, designed to reinforce the moral order of Roman society. The condemned criminals were presented as examples, showing the people the consequences of breaking Roman laws. But was it really about justice, or was it just another form of entertainment? Some believe that the executions were intended to show the people that even the most powerful and cruel figures in the empire could be brought down in the arena. If a powerful general or noble could be forced to die in public, it reinforced the idea that no one was above the law, not even those with wealth, power, or status. Of course, not all executions were quite so public. Some took place in the darkness of the hypergym, out of sight from the crowd, while others were presented in a way that blurred the lines between punishment and performance. For the prisoners of war, or the criminals condemned to die, the arena was a place of unimaginable horror. But for the audience, it was simply another part of the game. The blood, the screams, the sense of finality, it was all part of the show. The people of Rome were no strangers to violence, and the public executions became a routine part of life. In some ways, they were a form of entertainment as much as they were a display of power. The Colosseum's use for executions was a striking example of how violence permeated Roman society. These public killings weren't just about punishing wrongdoers. They were about reinforcing the social order, reminding everyone who was in control. And yet, in a strange way, they were also about showcasing the empire's ability to dictate life and death. The power of the emperor and the editor of the games was absolute. The people were there to watch, to cheer, to jeer, but in the end, they were all passive participants in the great spectacle of Roman power. The executions weren't always as theatrical, of course. Sometimes, the condemned were simply thrown to the wild animals, left to die in a brutal display of nature's power. These fights were often chaotic, unpredictable, and, in some ways, the most terrifying of all. The animals didn't care who they were attacking. They were just following their instincts, their ferocity brought out by hunger and the need to kill. In the arena, it was survival of the fittest, and the fate of the condemned was sealed before they ever stepped foot on the sand. But no matter how the executions were carried out, whether by animal or by sword, the underlying message was clear. The Roman Empire had the power to decide who lived and who died. These executions were part of a larger narrative, one that placed the emperor, the Roman people, and the arena itself at the center of the world. The Colosseum was a place where life and death were intertwined, where justice was dispensed in a public forum, and where the power of the empire was both on display and enforced with every blow, every shout, every death. As you watch the condemned fall, knowing that the end is near for them, you can't help but wonder how many others died in the name of Roman spectacle. How many lives were sacrificed for the sake of entertainment? How many public executions were just another day at the Colosseum? another reminder that the emperor had the final say? The answer is lost to history, but the memory of these brutal spectacles endures, woven into the fabric of the Roman Empire's legacy. As the crowd disperses and the sands of the arena slowly return to their peaceful, empty state, the echoes of the games still seem to hang in the air. Yet, the Colosseum's life wasn't destined to continue forever. The final chapter of its grand history is far from an immediate collapse. The decline of the Colosseum and of the gladiatorial games themselves was more gradual than dramatic. You might have imagined that the end came quickly, that one day the arena simply fell silent. But in reality, the games started to lose their luster as the empire's power weakened and its priorities shifted. By the late 5th century AD, the once mighty Colosseum was no longer the centerpiece of Roman entertainment. Instead, it began to decay and fall into ruin. The fall of the Colosseum didn't happen overnight, and the reasons for its decline are as complex as the gladiatorial games themselves. The decline of the Western Roman Empire played a significant role. As the empire weakened, its resources were stretched thin, and the focus on maintaining grand spectacles like the games began to wane. When Rome was sacked by barbarian tribes in 410 AD, and then again in 455 AD, the Colosseum's fate was sealed. Looters stripped the arena of its precious materials, taking whatever they could to sell or repurpose. What was once the epicenter of Roman entertainment became a casualty of empire collapse, an architectural monument stripped of its grandeur. But the Colosseum didn't just fall into ruin because of external forces. The internal decline of the Roman gladiatorial games played a key part. The games were expensive to organize, requiring vast amounts of resources and manpower. As the empire became more concerned with its own survival, maintaining such lavish spectacles became less of a priority. The rise of Christianity, too, had a profound impact. In 325 AD, the First Council of Nicaea issued a decree that forbade Christian participation in gladiatorial combat, a direct challenge to the games that had been such an integral part of Roman culture. Over time, the Christian church's influence grew, and the gladiatorial games were seen as barbaric and incompatible with Christian values. The last recorded gladiatorial games in the Colosseum were held in the early 5th century, after which the arena fell into disuse. It's hard to imagine what it must have felt like to see the Colosseum, once a symbol of Rome's power and opulence, fall into decay. The arena, once alive with the cries of gladiators and the roar of the crowd, was now just another ruined structure. The sands of the arena, which had been stained with the blood of countless battles, grew overgrown with weeds and dust. The Colosseum, once a grand stage for Rome's greatest spectacles, became a shadow of its former self. Yet, even in its ruin, the Colosseum retained a certain power, a reminder of the empire's grandeur, a symbol of both its might and its eventual downfall. The Colosseum's decline mirrors the decline of the Roman Empire itself. As the empire fractured and its borders shrank, the grand spectacles that had once been a symbol of Roman dominance became a luxury that the empire could no longer afford. The games, once an important tool for keeping the people entertained and distracted, were no longer necessary. The empire was facing far more pressing concerns. The Colosseum, like the empire it represented, was gradually left behind, its role in Roman society fading into memory. But even in its disrepair, the Colosseum continued to inspire awe. The ruins, with their crumbling stone and fractured arches, stood as a testament to the empire's once glorious past. They became a symbol of Rome's enduring influence, a reminder of its former power and the spectacle it created. And in the centuries that followed, the Colosseum would become a tourist destination, drawing people from all over the world to witness the ruins of the greatest arena the world had ever known. Interestingly, while the gladiatorial games had ended, the legacy of the Colosseum's spectacles didn't disappear. The Colosseum became a model for other arenas across the empire, influencing the design of later amphitheaters in the Roman world and even beyond. The idea of staging large-scale public spectacles, though not necessarily involving combat, continued long after the fall of Rome. The Colosseum's legacy can be seen in the arenas and stadiums that followed, from the grand theaters of medieval Europe to the modern sports arenas that fill our cities today. The Colosseum's architecture, its power as a symbol, and its cultural significance have lived on in ways that its original creators could never have imagined. As you stand in the shadow of the Colosseum's ruins, you can't help but reflect on the empire that built it. The Roman Empire was once the most powerful force in the world, its reach extending across continents. The Colosseum was its crown jewel, the symbol of Roman strength, pride, and entertainment. But even the greatest empires fall. The Colosseum's decay is a reminder that all things, no matter how powerful or grand, eventually fade. And yet, in the end, the Colosseum stands, imperfect, crumbling, but still magnificent, a monument to the power of Rome and the spectacle that defined it. As you stand in the shadow of the Colosseum, taking in its fractured walls and ruined arches, you can't help but feel a certain awe. It's easy to see why this ancient arena continues to capture the imagination. The Colosseum may have faded from its prime, but its legacy remains, influencing cultures and societies long after the empire collapsed. The world it once represented is gone, yet the Colosseum stands as a monument to an era where blood, spectacle, and power intertwined in a way that shaped the very identity of the Roman Empire. But beyond the grandeur of the building itself, what makes the Colosseum so enduring is its impact on what came after. The Colosseum, for all its bloodshed and brutality, was a reflection of the world that created it. The Roman Empire was a civilization built on spectacle, on the idea that people could be controlled and captivated by grandeur. The games, from gladiatorial combat to animal hunts to naval battles, were more than just entertainment. They were a way to reinforce the emperor's power and the strength of the empire. The Colosseum was the perfect embodiment of this philosophy. It wasn't just a place of bloodshed. It was a place where the Roman worldview was on full display, where life and death were manipulated for the enjoyment and distraction of the masses. But even as the empire crumbled, the influence of the Colosseum lingered. The games may have ended, but the idea of large-scale public spectacles did not disappear. From medieval jousts and tournaments to modern-day sporting events, the Colosseum's legacy can still be seen in how we view competition, power, and public entertainment. Even today, we continue to stage grand displays of athleticism, with packed stadiums and millions watching from around the world. While the nature of the entertainment has changed, the fundamental idea that people can be drawn together through large-scale spectacles remains the same. Perhaps it's the Roman obsession with spectacle that makes the Colosseum so fascinating. The Romans understood something deeply human, our desire to witness drama, to be part of something bigger than ourselves. The gladiatorial games were designed not only to entertain, but to remind the people of the emperor's power and of the empire's might. The Colosseum was the ultimate stage, where the boundaries between life and performance were blurred, where death itself was turned into a form of entertainment. And in that act of transformation, the Romans were able to create something that transcended the brutality of the games themselves. But as the years passed and the empire began to decline, so too did the significance of the Colosseum. With the rise of Christianity and the eventual collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the world that the Colosseum represented began to fade. The arena, once filled with the cheers and cries of spectators, slowly emptied out, the games forgotten, the empire that had birthed them crumbling under the weight of time. Yet, even as the arena was abandoned, its influence remained. The ruins, though crumbling, continued to inspire awe, a reminder of what once was. It's strange to think about the Colosseum as a symbol of the end of an era. The arena that had once been a place of vibrant life and brutal competition became a monument to Rome's past glory, a testament to a civilization that had shaped the world in ways that are still felt today. The games, for all their violence and excess, had served as both a distraction and a tool of control. The Colosseum had been a place where life and death were controlled by the empire, where the masses were kept entertained, distracted, and subjugated. But it was also a place where individuals, gladiators, criminals, prisoners of war, had to fight for their very survival, caught in a cycle of violence that had no end. As you continue to stand before the Colosseum, you can't help but reflect on the ways in which it shaped the world. The games may have ended, but their legacy is still with us, woven into the fabric of modern culture. From the grand stadiums we fill with sports fans to the drama we see on our screens, the spirit of the Colosseum lives on. The world may have changed, but the thirst for spectacle, the need for grand displays of power and strength, has remained constant. Perhaps the greatest irony of the Colosseum is that, in a way, it still fulfills the purpose for which it was built: entertainment. We may no longer witness gladiators fighting for their lives, but we still find ourselves drawn to the kind of spectacle that once defined ancient Rome. In the modern world, we've created new arenas, sports stadiums, concert halls, movie theaters, but the essential human need for drama, for competition, and for larger-than-life displays hasn't changed. The Colosseum, in all its ruin, remains the ultimate symbol of this desire for spectacle, a place where the power of the empire and the passions of the people were brought together in a single, unforgettable display. And so, as the last rays of light fade over the Colosseum, and the sound of the crowd's cheers fades into the past, we are left with a monument to a world that no longer exists. But its legacy endures. The Colosseum's rise and fall are a reminder of the fleeting nature of power, and the way in which history is shaped by both spectacle and survival. The empire may have crumbled, but the echoes of the games, the power they represented, and the enduring human desire for drama and entertainment will live on forever. As you sit quietly, the weight of the Colosseum's history lingers, and it becomes clear. The Colosseum wasn't just a space for entertainment, it was a reflection of Roman values, its politics, and its insatiable thirst for control. Even as its walls began to crumble, the echoes of what took place inside, gladiatorial combat, brutal animal hunts, mock naval battles, and executions, remained embedded in the psyche of the empire. The Colosseum was more than just stone and mortar. It was a tool of the emperor, a tool to shape public perception and remind the Roman people of the vastness of Roman power. It's tempting to think of the games as merely a brutal form of entertainment, designed to appease the masses, but the reality is more complicated. The games were, at their core, a method of social control. The emperor's ability to organize such grand spectacles was a reflection of his power. With every fight, every kill, he was able to reinforce his role as the ruler of all, reminding the people that their very lives were in his hands. The Colosseum's games kept the populace distracted, pacified, and in awe of their rulers. And in many ways, this was the genius of the Roman emperors, the ability to manipulate public opinion, to create a spectacle so grand that it overshadowed any concerns about the empire's true state. But there's also a darker side to this. The gladiators, the slaves, the prisoners of war, they were more than just pawns in a grand performance. They were men and women, each with their own hopes, fears, and dreams, thrust into a violent world that was not of their making. And while some may have fought for glory or freedom, many more fought simply to survive. Their stories were often forgotten, overshadowed by the grandeur of the games themselves. We remember the great gladiators, the ones who earned their place in the arena's history. But for every one of them, there were countless others who faded into the sand, their names lost to time. The games may have been a spectacle, but they were also a reflection of Roman society's deepest contradictions. On one hand, they were a way for the empire to showcase its power and control. On the other, they were a reminder of the empire's darker tendencies. The Colosseum was a place where life and death were determined by public opinion, by the whims of the crowd and the emperor's desires. It was a place where violence was normalized, where the line between performance and reality was blurred beyond recognition. As you reflect on this, it becomes clear that the Colosseum is not just a relic of the past, it's a symbol of something much larger. It represents the way societies can use spectacle to maintain control, to distract the people from the harsh realities of power. It's a reminder that entertainment, when wielded by those in power, can be as dangerous as it is captivating. The games were a means of reinforcing Roman supremacy, but they also laid bare the empire's moral decay. In the end, it was the very excess of the games, the lavishness of the spectacle, the bloodshed, the cruelty, that contributed to the empire's eventual downfall. The Colosseum's role as a public spectacle extended far beyond the gladiatorial contests themselves. The games were a key part of Roman political life, a tool for the emperor to display his power to the masses. The emperor was the center of the games, the figure around whom the entire spectacle revolved. His decisions determined who lived and who died, and the crowd's approval or disapproval of his actions could make or break a ruler's reign. In this way, the Colosseum became a microcosm of the empire itself, a place where power, spectacle, and survival intertwined. As the empire slowly crumbled, the Colosseum lost its significance. No longer could the emperors afford to host such grand spectacles, and the games themselves were eventually abolished. But even after the Colosseum fell into disrepair, its legacy lived on. The building, though in ruins, remained a symbol of Roman greatness, a reminder of the empire's power and its eventual decline. And though the gladiatorial games have long since faded into history, the Colosseum continues to draw people from all corners of the globe, its ancient stones telling the stories of a world that was both magnificent and brutal. The story of the Colosseum is one of rise and fall, of glory and decay, of life and death. It is a reminder that nothing lasts forever, that even the greatest empires can crumble, and even the most spectacular spectacles can fade into memory. Yet the Colosseum endures, standing as a testament to the Roman Empire's legacy, to its capacity for both spectacle and cruelty. And as we gaze upon its ruins, we are reminded not only of what was lost, but also of what continues to shape us today, the human desire for power, for control, and for the kind of spectacle that can capture the imagination of an entire civilization. In the end, the Colosseum's story is not just about the past. It's a reflection of the world we live in today, where spectacle continues to play a powerful role in shaping our perceptions of power, violence, and survival. From modern-day sporting events to the entertainment industry's larger-than-life productions, we still find ourselves drawn to the kind of drama that the Colosseum once offered. The games may be over, but the spirit of the Colosseum, the thirst for entertainment, for drama, and for power remains as alive as ever. As the sun begins to set, casting long shadows across the ruins, you realize the Colosseum's legacy isn't confined solely to its physical structure. It's a reminder of the immense cultural influence that the Games had, not just in Rome, but in shaping the future of entertainment across the world. The Colosseum may have faded into the past, its grandeur worn down by time, but its impact is still felt in arenas and theaters today. From sports stadiums to movie screens, the spectacle created by the Romans continues to captivate audiences around the globe. In many ways, the Colosseum was the birthplace of modern entertainment as we know it. The ancient arena didn't just set the stage for gladiatorial combat, it gave birth to the concept of public spectacle. The Games were about more than just violence and death. They were about creating an environment where the audience could lose themselves in the drama of the moment. It was about the crowd, the emperor, the gladiators, and the tension in the air as life and death hung in the balance. In the same way, modern sports and entertainment revolve around creating an environment where people can suspend their disbelief and become fully immersed in what's happening on the stage or field. We may have moved away from bloody combat, but the need for larger-than-life shows, intense competition, and thrilling moments remains just as strong. It's easy to dismiss the Games as just a form of barbaric entertainment, but when you look closer, you see how integral they were to Roman society. The Colosseum wasn't just a space for spectacle, it was a tool of social control, a place where the emperor could demonstrate his power and remind the people of the empire's supremacy. But as the empire weakened and the Colosseum began to fall into ruin, the Games also lost their relevance. The Colosseum became a relic of a past civilization, a symbol of both the heights of Roman achievement and the inevitable decline that followed. What is fascinating is that the fall of the Colosseum didn't signal the end of spectacle in human history. The need for public entertainment, for large-scale performances that capture the imagination of the people, has never gone away. From the gladiatorial games to modern-day sporting events, the desire for drama, competition, and spectacle is deeply ingrained in our culture. We may no longer gather in massive stone arenas to watch men fight to the death, but we still crave the excitement of competition, the thrill of a dramatic performance, and the opportunity to witness feats of skill and strength. Even in the midst of the Colosseum's decay, its influence remained. As centuries passed, and the ruins of the arena stood as a testament to Rome's lost glory, the world continued to stage its own spectacles. From the grand tournaments of the Middle Ages to the rise of modern professional sports, the desire to gather in large groups to witness a competition of skill and strength never died. And now, in the world of modern entertainment, we have created our own arenas, stadiums, concert halls, and movie theaters, where the crowd is still drawn together to witness larger-than-life performances that stir our emotions and engage our senses. But there's also something profoundly reflective in the ruins of the Colosseum. In its silence, as the crowds and the games have long since faded, we are left to contemplate the complex history of this ancient monument. It was a place where life and death were manipulated for public entertainment, a place where the power of the emperor was on full display. The Colosseum's story, then, is one of both fascination and tragedy. It's a reminder of the empire's power and reach, but it's also a reflection of the brutal realities of Roman society. It's a story about violence, spectacle, and the ways in which those in power use entertainment to maintain control over the masses. As you look out across the vast space of the arena, now abandoned and empty, it's hard not to be struck by the quiet. The echoes of the games are long gone, but the memory of what once took place here lingers, seeping into the stones, into the very air around you. The Colosseum, in its ruin, serves as both a monument to Roman power and a symbol of the fleeting nature of even the greatest empires. It is a reminder that all things, no matter how powerful, no matter how grand, must eventually fade. The Colosseum's end was inevitable. As Rome fell and the empire crumbled, so too did the games and the structure that had once been at the heart of Roman life. But even in its ruin, the Colosseum stands as a testament to the empire that built it, a reflection of the values and the culture that once shaped the world. And in the centuries since its decline, the Colosseum has become something more than just a ruin. It is a symbol, a reminder that even the most powerful civilizations are eventually consumed by time. It's a place that tells the story of Rome, the rise, the glory, the decadence, and the fall. As the night deepens and the Colosseum stands quietly against the darkening sky, you're left with the profound realization that history, no matter how far removed, is never truly gone. The Colosseum may no longer echo with the sounds of gladiators fighting for their lives, but it still stands as a monument to everything that came before it. It's a reminder that even in ruin, there is history, and even in the end, there is a story worth telling.